Welcome to my show. A guest here. His name is Leroy Slanzi. Mr. Leroy, how are you doing, sir?
I'm good. How are you doing today?
I'm fine. Thank you very much, Mr. Leroy. Firstly, you are a teacher. You're
Yeah,
also a principal and an author. Can you please, sir, discuss more about yourself and how you're doing currently now, sir?
yeah. I am a principal of an elementary school currently. I've been a principal of elementary, middle, and high schools. So I've you know led at all levels. I am in my 25th year. I have a couple of kids, a boy and a girl, and I'm also the author of three books. Releasing my third one today, as a matter of fact.
Wow, that is very, very nice. I wanted to also ask you to, discuss more about your book, which is Emotional Schools, the Looming Mental Health Crisis and a Pathway Through It, and the one you just released, sir.
Yeah, so I wrote Emotional Schools because I think the world around us is changing. There's a big influence from technology, social media, and just in terms of parenting compared to what it used to be. So, as a result, our kids aren't as resilient as they once were. And so I wrote the book to identify what's causing schools to be so emotional around the world, and what we need to do to help rectify kids being unable to cope and less emotional, or at least so they're in control of their emotions so they can be more successful in school. And the book that I'm releasing today, A New Leadership Paradigm, revolves around how to lead a school through what we are living as educators in this day and age all over the world.
Mm. Thank you so much, Mr. Leroy. You know, in our time today, the most school students go to is the private or the public school. Can you please tell us the key differences between the public and the private education from a teacher perspective, sir?
Yeah, I think the biggest difference is money. I think private schools, there's more money for kids because parents have to pay to get their kids into private schools, and private schools can be more linear in their focus in terms of what the philosophy of the school is, and public schools are more general studies and are typically underfunded compared to private schools. And because of that, it puts you know private schools in a better learning place than public schools. And um, it's a difference in terms of what kids have access to. And so, but other than that, I think, if there's fantastic teachers in public schools that draw the best out of kids, and we have some amazing kids that come out of public schools, and we can compete. We just can't compete in terms of resources like they have in the private sector.
Thank you so much, Mr. Leroy. And do teachers in private schools have more autonomy in their teaching method compared to those in public schools, sir?
I would say not. I would say when you're in a private school, you have certain mandates that your donors and your parents, when they pay big money for your kid to go to a certain private school, they're going to have certain expectations, and so teachers have to toe the company line. Whereas in public schools, teachers have more autonomy, more freedom to stretch the curriculum and be more creative, and focus on more global issues, whereas a private school would be more linear in their thinking.
Thank you so much, sir. And when it comes to the outcomes, there might be, different ways the outcomes happen between the public and the private education, sir? Are they noticeable differences in student outcomes between the public and the private education, sir?
I would be guessing a little because I don't know the data, but
Okay.
my assumption is that kids in a private system, if they have more affluent parents, they can pay for tutoring, they can have their kids, get extra help more than they can in the public system. So I would assume kids coming out of the private system are a little more academically advanced. That being said, kids in the public system, the top kids in a public system are just as strong, if not stronger, than kids in a private system because they're more holistic and global thinkers. And they have to work harder to get to where they need to go. And so, yes, private school kids may be more successful, but they may or may not have the same grit and resilience that a kid coming out of the public system may have.
I completely agree, Mr. Leroy. And diversity is one of the most important thing in many sectors today. So how do you think public school address diversity and inclusion compared to private schools, sir?
Well, a public school has to take everyone, regardless of ethnicity,
Okay.
regardless of background. Um, they have to take all kids. You don't get to choose who comes to your school, and as a result, you have more of a melting pot of people in a public school. You'll have kids from all over the world potentially, and um, those kids are going to be more tolerant and more inclusive. Whereas in a private school, they can be more selective of who they take into their school, and they can refuse kids or families for being a part of their school. So I think just inherently a private school is less inclusive than a public school because it's just set up that way. There's two different dynamics. And so as a result, you're going to see in a public school kids that are more open to experience and understanding of different cultures and perspectives. Or in a private school, they may learn about different cultures and perspectives, but they won't be experiencing it as much unless it's an international private school and you have international students there from all over the world. So that would be the difference.
Yes, that comes to the point of exposure. That means the students from the public are probably more exposed than the one in the private. And that's also drive me to the local community, sir. How do you possibly see public and private school engage with their local community, sir?
Um, well, I think because a public school is so diverse
Mm,
in terms of family and culture, especially I know you're in Nigeria, but here in Canada, just in the community I am, like we have people from Nigeria here. We have people from the Philippines. We have
wow.
people from India. We have people from Italy. We have indigenous people. And so our reach into the community here is naturally expansive. We naturally can reach into every part of our community. Whereas, in a private school, because it's less culturally diverse, I'm sure they can reach into the community in terms of fundraising and offer a little more in terms of potential financial donations and whatnot. But their reach may not be as natural and organic because we in a public school have kids that are attending our school that can go home to a culture.
Mm.
And in a private school, they may, like I said, unless it's an international school, they're not going home to a different culture. The culture that's there is pretty predominantly the same, I would say.
Completely agree. Thank you so much, Mr. Leroy. And discipline is a very important thing in school. Many parents possibly want to see their child disciplined. How do you think disciplinary policies rather vary between the public and the private schools, sir?
Well, I think in private schools, they probably do not tolerate misbehavior as much because they can basically kick a kid out of school if they're not following the private school philosophy. In a public school, we have to be more, um, what's the word I'm looking for? Uh, Flexible. We have to be more flexible in terms of how we discipline um, kids, and we have to be more open to them returning. There's more second chances in a public school. I mean, when push comes to shove, if a student is too violent or they're doing something that's abhorrent, then they can be expelled as well. But we definitely would probably have more strategies around dealing with behaviors than a private school because to get into a private school, you have to follow the rules or you don't get in. So if you get in and don't follow the rules, you're going to be out quickly.
Yes, I completely agree. And that also brings me to the what the administrators might be facing. It's not very easy when it comes to the private and the public sector. So I would like to know, like, what do you think are the biggest challenges administrators face in public schools versus the private schools, sir?
Well, in private schools, the mandate is academic success, which is the same in public schools, but there would be a higher level of demand from the parents that their kids are getting better marks in a private school because they're paying for it and they want to get what they pay for. In a public school, teachers strive to make sure kids are as successful as they possibly can, but it's not dictated by money. And because it's not dictated by money, it allows you to work on the whole child, not just academics. You can, develop communication skills, critical thinking skills. You can, develop compassion and kindness. You can spend more time on inclusivity and social justice issues. Whereas in a private school, the mandate from the parents to the school would be that their kids have an opportunity to go on to the best universities as well, right? The
Mm.
elite kind of universities. So I think that's where the pressure would come between the two.
I completely agree. Thank you so much, Mr. Leroy. And there will definitely be what no one or two misconception when it comes to the public and the private school, sir. What one misconception do you think people often have about public or private schools that you would like to clarify, sir?
Well, I think people um, might see public school as lesser than. Um, and in my opinion, public schools offer something that private schools can't, and that you learn about life and the trials and tribulations about life more so because you naturally have interactions outside of classrooms with a diverse array of people. And you're developing more holistic kids in a public school, and you combine that with the academic rigor of a public school. And I think people don't think public schools have academic rigor when they do. They're rigorous, and kids go to university all the time out of public schools. And I think, people have this misconception possibly that, their kids are going to get a better education in a private school. But I would beg to differ that in a public school they're getting a more well-rounded education. Um, and I think in a private school, I believe there's the misconception is like I just labeled that, they're not going to be as well-rounded. However, I do think they in private schools, well, I know in private schools, they do try to teach kids to be socially aware and be inclusive. However, it's coming from a place of being taught from an adult rather than a lived experience. And so I think that's the difference. Um, I also think that people would label a private school as being sterile and uniform based and whatnot. But I think I've met a lot of private school teachers and administrators who are incredibly creative and compassionate and caring people. So it's not always about the money in a private school, even though it is. Um, Teachers are still teachers and they care, whether they're private or public schools.
Hmm, completely agree, Mr. Leroy. The public, you meet people, different type of people, you face things, but the private is still more of, conductive and stuff like that. Thank you so much, Mr. Leroy. And lastly, what advice would you give to parents deciding between public and private education, sir?
I would recommend that they go to a public school. My kids go to a public school because I want my kids to meet people and kids from all different cultures and backgrounds and become more holistic through actual experience rather than a top down teaching method. So it's unfortunate though that there's not as much funding in a public school for resources and whatnot, but do your homework. There's public schools out there that are quite fantastic. And that being said, I mean, if there was a private school that focused on basketball or volleyball, and like my daughter, for example, is a great volleyball player, I would consider a private school so she could hone. If she had aspirations to go on to play volleyball post secondary, I would push that. But ultimately, though, I think public school is where your kid is gonna learn in the trenches about life.
Yes, completely agree, Mr. Leroy. And there is a question I normally ask Mr. Leroy. From the ancestors, from the forefathers, there are a lot of things that exist during our ancestral time that is missing in our time today. If there is anyone or anything you would like to bring back to our time today, what do you think that thing would be, sir?
Grit, perseverance. I think that's kind of what's missing is that our this generation of kids don't have the same ability to persevere and to fight through difficult situations. They don't have as much grit as they used to. And I think it has a lot to do with technology and not needing to work as hard as the generations before them. That being said, I do think kids can develop those skills, which is why I wrote the book. And yeah, I think it's that the trials and tribulations of life are less prominent today with kids than they were when we grew up.
Yes, I completely agree, Mr. Leroy. Technology has really taken over many things. Things that even take a month, 2 months to achieve during that time. In our time today, someone can just achieve it within a week due to the influence of
Mm-hmm.
technology that we have today. And
Yeah,
I sincerely want to personally thank you for your time, for the effort, for speaking about this big differences because a lot of parents really know they really want to know what is this and what is this from an experienced person like you. I want to sincerely thank you and I also want to congratulate you for your book that you released today. Congratulations on that and thank you so much, sir.
thank you. You have yourself a great Saturday. Well,
Yes.
best of luck.
All right.
Bye
Bye
bye.
bye.